Hello, Akira here, and welcome back to the channel. Today's video essay is going to be about the importance of speed as a stat in Fire Emblem. This will first be covered conceptually, as in my video about res, followed by a look at two case studies of what happens when you remove speed from a Fire Emblem game. This comprises a look at a game that's explicitly not designed around it in the form of my recently concluded Zero Speed FE8 Iron Man, and then what happened in a hack called Doubled or Nothing by Archer Bias, where units having no speed is an intentional choice that the game is designed around. So, let's get started and take a look at why speed is so important. Though your damage per hit proper comes from your attack stat and the might of the weapon being wielded, speed plays a key role in offense. This is because all of the Fire Emblem games have a game-specific attack speed threshold that, if met or exceeded, means that you are able to double your opponent, with the pursuit skill also being needed to double in the case of FE4. Any given unit damaging another twice with the same weapon does more damage to them than just hitting them once with the same weapon. Speed is therefore a very important offensive stat for being able to reliably double and one-round KO various enemy types. In the same way that speed increases your unit's potential offensive performance, this also means that speed has an additional role as a defensive stat. Having sufficient speed can prevent your unit from being doubled and therefore taking more damage themselves. This means that when facing any given enemy, speed has two thresholds, the threshold to double them, and the threshold that prevents them from doubling you. Of course, this means that with many different enemy types present, there can be many variable thresholds. For example, here is a graph from data processed and collated by my friend and fellow FE tuber, Actual Lizard, of the speed threshold to double each quartile of enemies for each chapter in maddening mode in Fire Emblem Engage. By subtracting 10 attack speed, twice the attack speed threshold for doubling from all values on this graph, you translate the graph into one of quartiles where enemies will double you instead. On another defensive note, speed also affects your avoid, giving either 1 or 2 points of avoid per point. As a result, this means that if your avoid is stacked high enough through various means, it can contribute towards making dodge tanking a viable possibility. Though I personally don't value dodge tanking itself highly as it is unreliable, it's worth noting that in games where enemies choose who to attack based on expected damage, factoring in both the damage of the attack should it land and its hit chance, such as in Engage, the contribution to avoid can lead to enemies reliably attacking a different target. This I do value. Still, ignoring the dodge tanking stacking or AI manipulation moments, speed is, at its core, a threshold stat relating to doubling. This is not to say that it makes it unimportant. All the stats are threshold stats in some form, and with speed contributing heavily to both the ability to one-round KO and not get one-round KO'd, it is greatly appreciated and arguably the most important one due to its dual offensive and defensive nature. This is not least because to some extent a lack of strength or magic proper can be made up for through the ability to trade off some points of speed to use a higher weight and might weapon, as is the case for many Pegasus Knights throughout the series. Speed being so obviously good as a stat to have means that this section on the value of speed gets to be rather short. Still, speed being important does not mean that the unit has to possess the speeds themselves, especially in the games that allow for substantial stat stacking. This is because, as with all the stats in the series, there have been various methods of augmenting speed. When I say augmenting, I mean methods of increasing a stat that don't actually increase the unit stat itself. So I don't count a stat booster like a speed wing, but would count an item or a skill that functionally increases your speed, even if it's literally speed plus 2, which does the same thing. There are two main eras of this, pre and post DSFE. Starting with pre-DSFE, Gaiden, the second game in the series, is the earliest game that gives a method of augmenting speed in the form of the speed ring. It's a bit ridiculous, increasing a unit's speed to the cap of 40. As a side note, it also gives them a whopping 5 move, which is also a tiny bit ridiculous. In both aspects, it is significantly less strong in the remake Shadows of Valentia, giving quote-unquote only 10 speed and 1 move. Then FEs 4 through 8 all have some specific weapons that can increase a unit's speed, such as the Forseti Tome in Jugdral, the Mulligear Bow in Alib, and the S-rank Animatome Excalibur in Magvel. However, it is worth noting that speed may interact with the con stat to mean that the unit using said weapon may not actually be faster. As an example of this, FE8 Excalibur Tome has 13 weight and gives plus 5 speed when equipped, meaning that only a unit with more than 8 con will experience a speed boost. This means that without a body ring, for instance, Sage and Mage Knight Loot will lose 4 or 2 speed, respectively. The reason why I differentiate pre and post DSFE is because from FE12 onward, there are various methods of stat stacking available. While a full exploration of stat stacking goes beyond the scope of this video, these methods are tonics in FE12, Awakening, Fates, and Engage, power-up bonuses in Awakening and Fates, rallies in Awakening, Fates, Free Houses, and Engage, meals in Fates, Free Houses, and Engage, and then various skills such as Speed +2, darting below for player phase attack speed, and Speed Taker. This means, for instance, that it isn't difficult to speed stack units in games such as Conquest, to the point where they can double many enemy types without actually having good speed themselves. Additionally, especially in pre-well Engage, there were many conversations arguing for attack over speed as the most valuable stat, due to speed being easily fixable through Emblem Lin's Speed Plus and Speed Taker skills, even with the +20 effect cap for stacking any stat. Additionally, there are definitely settings where speed ends up being so tiered that units are functionally always either doubling or getting doubled by units in different speed tiers, with it being very difficult to meaningfully shift speed tiers without concerted effort or level up luck. Best examples of this, in my opinion, are Echoes and Free Houses. In the case of Echoes, this is immediately the case due to the doubling threshold being only 1 point of speed, as in the original game Gaiden, and the existence of class bases, meaning that many units get dragged up in all of offense, defense, and bulk upon promotion. As an example, the base 18 speed of Dreadfighters is enough to double nearly everything in the game on hard mode, aside from enemy Dreadfighters, Moguls, Gargoyles, and one specific late game boss. Due to generally low weapon might on enemies as well, true defensive bulk can be valuable, especially in situations where the player is able to leverage their forgeable effective weaponry well, such as with Rider's Bane Clive with the plethora of enemy cavaliers in Arms Act 3. As has been commented on by Rengor, much of this philosophy has been carried across into Free Houses, where, especially on Maddening mode, there are some really demanding speed thresholds. This is the case with Thieves during the really early game, but is most marked with the Swordmasters in the late game, with around 45 to 50 attack speed, who also have quick riposte, just to make sure that you really aren't doubling them. This means that barring blessed speed and / or already speedy units, you almost invariably need some other way of dealing with them, whether through protection tanking in the early game particularly, or killing them before they can kill your units. Additionally, the strongest kill tools that Free Houses gives the player do not require attack speed based doubling potential. The best free examples of this are general one-hit KO tools like effective damage against Cavs and Flyers, especially absurdly fast Falcos, and stat-scaling combat arts such as Frozen Lance, brave combat arts, both unit-specific like Swift Strikes and Point Blank Volley, and locked-specific advanced classes like Hunter's Volley and Fierce Iron Fist, and builds that leverage some amount of lost HP, such as Vengeance and the various Vantage Wrath combinations that enable potential one-shots on player and enemy phases, respectively. It helps that tools like the Blessing and Impregnable Wall Gambit and Guard Adjutants also provide survivability to units who would get doubled anyway, while also potentially helping to set these up. The accessibility of Vantage Wrath in some form especially, as a method of killing enemies on enemy phase, decreases the comparative strategic worth of dodge tanking if said dodge tank isn't going to kill the enemy. With dodge tanking especially often requiring Alert Stance Plus from A+ flying to be reliable, it can be, I think, fairly argued that any potential tutoring, grinding, etc. invested past the point of being able to gamble flying class certifications could well be divested into getting one of Vantage or Wrath instead on people who have one of the battalion equivalents. Low health builds aside, the end result of all this is that in Free Houses, doubling speed thresholds can become untenable, and that for your strongest kill tools, meeting them isn't required. This means that once said tools come online in the mid-game onward, it can be argued that speed as a stat becomes pretty unnecessary in many contexts, and is therefore not as valuable to have even as an augmented stat. Still, compared to Res, speed is more generally important as a stat due to its impact on both your own and enemy units' combat. It also has fewer unique methods of being stacked compared to the abundance of Pure Waters and Barrier Staves in many games. This is especially noteworthy considering that these tools exist in many games other than the post-DSFE ones, where stat stacking is basically not a concept. Additionally, many of the games that offer the player easy access to speed stacking also give them access to easy forms of damage stacking through methods such as forging effective or high might weaponry and various Vantage builds, as is the case with Free Houses. So it's not necessarily that in Free Houses speed is bad to have. It's more that many other tools in that game are busted, and if you are going to take part in more traditional combat, it can still be valuable on your own units, and notable as a concern to plan around on enemy units. This is especially the case in the early game before said tools come online broadly, or even for individual units, giving a genuine use case and niche for certifying a unit into Thief at level 10 for the 11 base speed. It's also worth pointing out that Vantage Wrath builds not only decrease the relative worth of speed for dodge tanking, but also defense and res for traditional tanking past the initial setup threshold. As a result, even in these cases where speed can be heavily augmented or later discounted entirely, it still remains a comparatively valuable stat among the basic combat stats for its early combat contributions. So, that's been a closer look at the value of speed as a stat proper, the methods and effects of augmenting it, and settings where it ends up being functionally less valuable. Now let's move on to our case studies, starting off by asking the question, what happens when you remove speed from a game not balanced around it? The case study for this one is an FE8 Iron Man that I did where all playable units had 0 personal speed base and 0 personal speed growth. As a game that came out before meaningful speed stacking could be done, the only methods of acquiring speed were through promotion, speed wing usage, lucky Metastone rolls, or equipping specific stat augmenting weapons like GOM. Unsurprisingly, this led to very different unit performances and meta, as shown in the playthrough tier list that I made after the end of the run. As I thought it would, the lack of speed greatly curtailed units' offensive capabilities. Effective weaponry such as the regular leaf for calves and armors, and the sacred twin weapons against monsters became very important for one-shots, just to clear enemies out of the way. Mind, even for enemies we didn't do effective damage to, it was still possible to pull off one-shots for quite some time, such as with General Gilliam being able to one-shot the Berserk Druid in Chapter 14b. More importantly though was the impact on unit durability, which was much worse. This was to the point where on 2 separate occasions, enemies preferred going for actual units rather than phantoms. Even middling bulk was often not enough, exemplified in the death of Seth on Phantom Ship from exact damage due to 4 AS Moguls, and meant that actual high defense units, such as Gilliam and Myr with Dragonstone bonuses, were genuinely useful, even if just for tanking alone. Despite the widespread issue of unit squishiness though, frail units with non-combat utility, such as Kanto rescue dropping, healing, or dancing, remained valuable. If anything, they became more so due to our limited attack power, since if being used solely for those purposes, their actual combat stats don't matter anyway. The stocks rose most markedly for summoners, who I am not huge on in vanilla, but in this context usually provided a lightning rod target for an enemy. Still, all utility units became much harder to protect, due to reduced capacity for tanking enemies themselves, and other units failing to kill enemies that would endanger the squishies. Then, in an indictment of FE8 enemy quality, some enemies are wildly slow. Leon 2 in the finale only had 5 attack speed, meaning that I actually had a combat forecast saying that I would double him. That is definitely what made this reasonable as an Iron Man though. Some situations were straight up not winnable in bare one-on-one combat. As the best examples, my initial quote-unquote plan for how I was going to deal with Mortha, who due to true damage doubled and killed anyone not using GOM with an additional speed booster, and the Demon King, who is basically a non-factor in vanilla, was with human wave tactics with the monster effective weapon. Thankfully, I got the Purge Siege Tome for Bishop Arto with Slayer to use to get me out of various sticky situations, but that was more a fortunate coincidence than anything else. That's just a brief overview of the run. If you're interested in further details of the run, I made recap videos for it and a final compilation video thereof that I released last Sunday. So, let's move on to a quick look at a hack called Doubled or Nothing by Archer Bias, which is explicitly designed around your units having 0 speed base and personal growth. Additionally, all enemies, including Ballistae, have 4 or more attack speed, meaning that they will always double and do significant damage to you if you don't take advantage of the various tools the hack gives you. And Archer Bias gives you a lot of tools. For example, regarding speed augmentation, there are rings that give you +1 speed in exchange for -2 in another stat, and weapons that give speed on equip, such as the Sunrise Blade, which gives +3 speed, or the Thief exclusive Knave Knife that gives +12. It's a fun design choice that allows for greater speed tier differentiation of enemies, and means that as in vanilla FE, it can be possible to speed stack, usually to the point of not getting doubled, and thus greatly improving survivability. Then on the weaponry front, there are a lot of brave weapons in the hack, including brave tomes, which we haven't had very many of historically in the series compared to standard physical weapons. As in vanilla and with 0-speed FE8, effective weaponry becomes very important for one-shots, and with both many flying enemies and one range-locked enemies, it's a situation where, true to the username, the early archer can actually shine. There are even weapons that increase the user's other stats, like the defensive light tome Guardian, which gives the wielder +8 defense, and therefore makes the frail monk much bulkier. All in all, it's a really cool experience with a fun gimmick. Said gimmick being baked into the hack's design also means that it gets to avoid the awkwardness I experienced in 0-speed FE8. There you can cheese some pain points through volley grinding and protection stacking in a setting that doesn't feature dangerous effective weaponry against your own units. It also means that being able to solve the problems posed by the game is by design rather than by accident. The hack is also only 10 chapters long, and so isn't as much of a time investment compared to a full-length Fire Emblem game. Chapters aren't easy either, complimentary, so I would highly recommend it, which you can find a link to the FE Universe page in the description below. If you're still not sold on checking it out, after the end of this video, I would also recommend checking out my friend Danny Doyle's ROM hack recommendation review of it, which will be linked in the description and in the end card of this video. Moving on to our conclusion. Despite there being contexts where speed is unimportant, or a lack thereof can be worked around, speed is clearly an important stat because of how much doubling, both on the player and the enemy's part, can affect combat parameters. Especially Fire Emblem settings that don't have as many methods of one-shotting or augmenting speed play very differently when the speed stat itself is removed. This is the case in both contexts where the lack of speed is a choice the developers designed around, as in Double or Nothing, or explicitly not designed around, as in my edit to Sacred Stones. As a result, speed's presence greatly affects the flow of combat, and therefore the feel of Fire Emblem gameplay as a whole. If you're still here, thank you for watching the video. I imagine that most people watching this definitely didn't need to be converted to the speed good camp. Still, hopefully this has been an interesting look at the finer details of when it is and isn't important in vanilla Fire Emblem, as well as what happens when you remove it as a stat entirely. In addition to you, the viewer, I would like to thank the following people for contributing to this video. Actual Lizard, for giving me permission to use their Engage Maddening doubling speed threshold data, Casual Jacob for the Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia speedring images, USS Gordon Captain for checking my Shadows of Valentia speed benchmarks, John O'Abo for reading over the section on Three Houses, and Danny Doyle for reading over the brief section on Double or Nothing. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider letting me know in some form, whether it be through liking or commenting on it, or subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I would love to know your thoughts on it, either here or in the community Discord, which you can find a link to join in the description. Thanks again, and I really encourage checking out Doubled or Nothing and Danny's review on it. Regardless, I hope to see you again next time. Until then, have a good one.